Michael Moffitt is the Philip H. Knight Chair in Law and former Dean at the University of Oregon Law School, University of Oregon School. Professor Moffitt has published more than 24 scholarly articles on mediation, negotiation, and civil procedure. Before teaching at Oregon Law, he served as a clinical supervisor for the mediation program at Harvard Law School and taught negotiation at Harvard and Ohio State. Following a federal judicial clerkship, he spent several years with Conflict Management Group, consulting on negotiation and dispute resolution projects in about 20 countries around the world. He is currently the Roger D. Fisher Visiting Professor in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Harvard Law School, where he leads the negotiation workshop. It is a pleasure to introduce to you Professor Michael Moffitt and salary negotiation and your next job. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for the introduction, Carrie. This is not my first time to Brown. I've had occasion to come principally because my little sister teaches here, which is not part of the introduction, but I think that's probably appropriate there. And I spent this afternoon working with some of you who I recognize in some classes on negotiations in another context. And as you could tell from my background, my study of negotiation is certainly not limited to salary negotiations, and it actually didn't start with salary negotiations, although I remember performing quite badly in some early salary negotiations, and so it probably was part of the motivation. The reality of many negotiations in the contexts in which I have done them is that negotiations fall into patterns that span the contexts. The kinds of mistakes I have made in salary negotiations have been replicated in many different other contexts, and some of the better practices are things that we can recognize across contexts. And so what I want to suggest, at least for part of tonight, is that I not spend a bunch of time sharing with you the academic research aspects of negotiation. I am happy to talk with you about studies in all kinds of different disciplines, but I'm not sure that it's the first and best use of our time in this particular context. I want instead to share with you some of my very best advice for how to do it as effectively as possible. And then if you want to talk about the academic geeky studies, I'd be so delighted to do that. The reality is, even if you were a Brown student and you wanted to spend all of your 4 years in the open curriculum studying negotiation, you would take classes in a lot of different places, because psychology has something to teach us about how human beings try to influence each other. But so does economics, and so do politics, and so does law, and so does neuroscience, and. And we'll touch briefly on a few of those things, but again, not from an academic perspective, but instead from the perspective of what matters most as you go into salary negotiations in particular. So I'll try hard to be at least passingly useful, and I will also try hard to be quick about it so that we can get to questions and answers with some time still to spare this evening. The place I'm going to ask you to join me in starting is with a quick exercise. It's not an onerous one. It doesn't require homework or anything like that, but it does require that you be in groups of 3. 2 doesn't work super well, 4 definitely doesn't work. So if you could engage in that junior high school look, make eye contact, sort of group up kind of thing, that would be really helpful to me. Great. And if numbers conspire to mean that you are in a group of 2, life will carry on. And so that's just fine. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you, the first negotiation I'm going to ask you to engage in as a threesome is to identify person A, person B, and person C. This is a relatively low stakes negotiation, but go ahead and do that now. All right. I'm gonna cut you off there. I didn't actually budget a lot of time for that negotiation, so person B, I want to talk to you first. Person B, you're going to be a buyer here in a minute, so think hard about what you care about in life. Person C, now some instruction for you. I'm going to ask you in real life, not hypothetically, in real life, to think of something you have, something you own, or something you're good at, something you could sell. Could be a good, it could be a service, something legal, please. But other than that, the criterion is fairly restricted, but it's something that person C is actually capable of selling. And in just a minute, I'm going to ask person C to try to sell that thing to person B. But first I have some instructions for person A, and I have to deliver these instructions secretly. So here's what I'm going to ask. Persons B and C, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes just for a second. I promise we won't do anything untoward to you. I should see at most 1/3 of the eyes in the room at the moment, and I don't. All right, person A, here's going to be your job, all right? But I'm not going to say it out loud. In a minute, I'm going to ask you, person A, to do some observation. I'm going to ask you to do that. Okay? Got that? Okay, so now everybody can open your eyes. Person C, when I say go, I'm going to invite you to do your very best to sell whatever it is you want to sell to person B, and I'm going to give you a minute in which to do it. Go. They'll be done shortly. Okay, I'm going to pause you there. My first question is whether there were any sales in the room. Did we consummate any deals in the room? No. One. All right, great. What did you sell?
Sold live music.
Live music. Great. For what?
Graduation party.
And in exchange for?
$25 per hour per musician.
Fabulous. All right. So we have a musician performing at graduation. Any other sales? No. Okay. Well, we could just ask questions of the one successful person in the room and make that the point this evening. Instead, I'm gonna share with the room what it was that person A was doing. Person A had a job. Person A was invited to count what it was that person C was doing, whether they were making statements or asking questions. So, person A, I'm going to give you 15 seconds in which to share the data that you collected with the other two participants. Go ahead and do that now. Okay. So, so I'd love to hear a sense of the answers. Give me an example of the ratio of questions to statements in your group. What was the ratio?
1 to 5.
1 to 5 in this group. Back there? 3 to 2. Others? I'm sorry? 2 to 10. Okay. Others?
5 to 3.
5 to 3. All right. So what, raise your hand if your seller asked more questions than made statements. A couple, okay. So more statements than questions, as most of the room, okay. I've only done this exercise once where that ratio wasn't roughly the case. One time I did this exercise, and every single group raised their hands for more questions. It was a time when I was working for a group of professional salespeople. These were pharmaceutical salespeople, and all day long, all they did was sell, and every single one of them asked more questions in this exercise, and that surprised me, delighted me kind of, creeped me out a little. Their explanation was this: how on earth am I going to persuade the other side if I don't know what they care about? I'm in a much better position to persuade them if I know more about them. And yet most of us have the instinct to go in with our best arguments, our best descriptions. Here's why you should love this thing. I start with this on an evening about salary negotiations because I fear that most of us in that context will enter that conversation armed with our arguments for why they should buy this thing that is us for a lot. And even if you remember nothing else, and I hope that's not the case, just to be super clear, but even if you remember nothing else from this evening, my suggestion is that if all else fails, ask questions. There is very little more persuasive than being open to persuasion. And this is particularly true in a context like the one that we will be considering. So what I would invite you to do is to join me in thinking about negotiation a little more broadly than the particular of salary negotiations, because from some of those negotiations, as I indicated at the beginning, I think some of the patterns that will affect the rest of salary negotiations will become clear. So if I say to you, what do you picture when you picture negotiations? Something flashes to mind for you, right? Maybe it looks like this, or maybe it looks like this, or maybe this, or this. Maybe negotiation looks like that to you. Maybe it's something like that. I don't know what's in your head. Maybe it's that. There are like 8 things wrong with that, but it makes me laugh, so I put it in there. The image that we have of negotiation in many ways winds up driving how a lot of us bring ourselves into the negotiation, and in many ways can wind up affecting how we act in the negotiation. Some of those images that I just showed you will lead people to engage, at least in an initial posture in the negotiation, in ways that may or may not serve them well. The most helpful, if I knew nothing about your context, the most helpful image that I can offer you is one that is simple efforts at persuasion. To my mind, we are negotiating every time we are engaged in some form of communication with the intention of persuading someone else. With that sort of broad definition, a whole bunch of different things lend themselves to potential prescriptions. Whereas more narrow conceptions of negotiation tend to cause people to lock into a set of behaviors that don't wind up serving themselves as well, at least in broad contexts. There are some caricature versions of negotiations out there, right? There is a positional haggle version of negotiation that looks something like this. One side comes in and says, give me $1 billion. And the other side says, I will give you a dime. And then the first side says, 500 million. And the other side says, $1.50. But this is my last offer. And the other side says, 1 million, that's my last offer. And the other side says, 10,000, but I hate you. And the other side eventually says, I'm going to get out of here. This is my last. Oh, yeah, you're terrible. Right? And then there's just a bunch of this. And then maybe eventually, final last, they get somewhere. Right? This is a version of negotiation. It is more prominent on TV than in real life, but it can't be denied that this positional version of unilateral conditional commitments that are offered in isolation, in sequence, is one way of negotiating at least some things. There are variants on this theme, right? One side says, this is our offer. The other side says some version of, what, really? And the first side says, yes. And they say, okay. Right? There's a version of positional negotiation that doesn't have as many rungs and ladders to it, where you just concede. And I want to be clear, it's not that either of these positional versions of negotiation don't have some upsides. There are ways in which these sorts of negotiations might serve you well. What are their benefits? They are things like, well, it doesn't take a lot of preparation, right? You just go in prepared to say no to whatever they say. That doesn't take you the cab ride over to the negotiations to prepare. They are familiar, at least to many. This way of negotiating for some people is fun. For some people. There are contexts in which these kinds of negotiation may feel like you're making progress. Right? If you go back to this sort of a negotiation, it feels like you're moving towards something, even if it is with lots of threats. So it's not that there's no benefit to this way of negotiating. It's just that this way of negotiating is enormously costly on relationships. It is costly in terms of efficiency because each side is making unilateral conditional commitments which preclude trade-offs among things that you might care about. They are costly because, in part, they cause each of the negotiators to behave in ways that invite the other negotiator not to believe them. These are credibility destroying, right? Because to do this well, you have to say things you don't mean. And that has some costs to it, etc. What I'm going to suggest is that there are other ways that people negotiate. I'm going to suggest 4 elements to another way of approaching negotiations that, in my experience, serve people well. These are not the only 4. If we had more time, I would suggest that there are at least 7, many of which have lots of subcomponents. But then I teach my introductory negotiation course has 116 class hours of meeting. We have an hour tonight, so you're getting the short version. And I'm happy to fast forward through some of these. But as a preview, we'll talk about interest, options, criteria, and alternatives, some specialized terms within the negotiation literature. So let's start with interests. Interests the notion is that every person enters a negotiation with a set of incentives, a set of concerns, a set of fears, things that she is hoping to achieve in this conversation with this other person. And those are rarely reducible accurately to a single term or currency. Instead, there is usually a range of sets of interests. So, for example, this is not a hypothetical. 2 weeks ago, I brought my high school daughter to Brown because she is in the where do I want to go to college game at the moment, which has created any number of dynamics in my family, none of which I am happy to speak of on camera. But imagine that she finally chooses a place to go to college and decides that she needs to, I don't know, we can project forward, and she's apartment hunting Imagine my daughter says, found the building where I want to live, but I have to live on the 4th floor. Why might she do that? Well, something is motivating this position of hers. What might be some examples of why my daughter might insist on the 4th floor? Just give me some examples. Maybe it's a safety issue, right? Burglars will be tired by there. Why else might she want the 4th floor? Maybe that's where her friends are. Good. Proximity to friends. What are other possibilities? Why else?
Maybe she likes the number 4.
4's her lucky number. Good. What else?
She won't have to worry about people above her.
Right. No noise above her. Maybe 4 is the top floor. What else?
She likes the view.
The good view. Good. What else? What else might she want it? Maybe she wants to get in shape and there's no elevator. Maybe she thinks it's cheaper. But I don't know. I literally don't know what my 17-year-old daughter wants or why. But imagine that what she said was, I must be on the 4th floor. Well, if we're negotiating with her, we're in a relatively awkward posture as the landlord of this building, right? The potential solution sets are limited if all we know is she wants to be on the 4th floor. By contrast, if we know which of these hypotheses is correct, we have the possibility of at least broadening the universe of negotiated outcomes, right? If, in fact, it is that she wants to be close to her friends, and I don't have any things on the 4th floor, but I have 3 units on the 2nd floor to which they can all move, that's a possibility. If 4 is her lucky number, and we don't have anything available on the 4th floor, but we know 4 is her lucky number, maybe we can offer her unit 2444. Look at all those 4s. Right? Who knows? The idea behind digging at interests is that if the other side has expressed nothing other than a position, we're in a poor posture to satisfy their interests if we don't know what they are. And if we go into the negotiation not having a good sense of what our motivations are, we won't be in a position to maximize our utility out of any potential deal. So, Shel Silverstein, is this a, all right, so there's a poem by Shel Silverstein that says, Mr. Spatz had 21 hats and none of them were the same. Should be was the same just for the English majors in the group, but there we are. Mr. Spatz had 21 hats and none of them were the same, and Mr. Smeds had 21 heads and only 1 hat to his name. Now when Mr. Smeds met Mr. Spatz, they talked of the buying and selling of hats. Right? What deal should they do? What's the deal here that should be cut? You who are now experienced in the world of negotiation, I mean, what's the deal?
Sell hats.
Yeah, this guy. And Mr. Spatz bought Mr. Smed's hat. Did you ever hear anything crazier than that? That's not crazy. Right? If Mr. Smats has told us nothing about his interests, what do we know about Mr. Spatz? Mr. Spatz' interests? This guy likes hats. Right? How surprised should we be that he bought a hat? This guy's got a lot of hats. You should look for whatever the interests are underlying your and the other parties' negotiation motivation. So in a salary negotiation, now to bring it here, this presentation is framed as a salary negotiation, largely because my experience is if I say I'm going to talk about job negotiations, people don't come. And if I talk about salary negotiations, people come. And I want to say right at the outset, if all you are thinking about is your salary in job negotiations, you are poised to do less well for yourself than you would be if you think broadly about your interests. Now, I don't want to misstate that. I don't want to overstate that. I am not saying you should not care what you get paid. But your interests, even around compensation, are not accurately captured just by a dollar figure. And so what I would say is, well, what do you care about? Yes, you care about what your salary is, and you care about benefits, and you care about your job title, and you care about your responsibilities, and you care about your vacation and the mentorship and your opportunities for advancement, and. Right? There's a lot of stuff you care about. Many human beings get sucked into caring about that which is most easily quantifiable, and there's some fun studies about people doing this. If you think you might be at risk of being one of those human beings, then I would suggest finding a way either to quantify everything for yourself or at a minimum document what those other interests are. Even the act of writing down what it is that you care about somehow makes most of us accountable to that list that we just made. If you say, here are the 3 things I care most about, and then you go in, you will try to negotiate hard on those 3 things. So make a good list in advance of what those things are. Now that's on your side. On their side, the advice is figure out what they care about. Not the caricature of them, what that person on the other side of the desk actually cares about. Most of us fall into the trap of imagining they want the opposite of what you want. Because so much of negotiation presents the distributive aspects of the problem, where a dollar more for you is a dollar less for them. But the reality is, negotiators' interests create something of a Venn diagram in which there are some shared interests, some interests in opposition, and many interests that are simply different. All 3 present opportunities for you. It is not the case that your future boss doesn't want you to be successful in your job. Right, or I suppose if that is the case, you really shouldn't take that job. They want you to be successful in your job. They probably even want you to perceive the prospect of advancement in your career. I don't want to hire somebody who I think is thinking this is her or his last job most of the time. I don't want to hire somebody who is thinking, I'm going to do this job for at least a week until I find something better. That's probably not who I'm after. But the more you can get a sense of what I, as prospective hirer, care about, the better you will be in a position to persuade me. Think back to whatever it is you were trying to sell to each other at the beginning of this. Ask questions. How do you figure out what they care about? Here are my 3 quick tips on how to figure out what somebody cares about. Ask why. Why do you want that? Why is that the number? Why do you care about the thing you care about? Oftentimes they'll just tell you. Sometimes why doesn't work, and so if that doesn't work, ask why not. That would sound like this. What would be wrong with paying a lump sum bonus as opposed to spread out over 3 years? Most of us are constitutionally incapable of turning down the opportunity to criticize someone else's idea. And so, given the opportunity to criticize someone's idea, we do. And if what you really want is to understand what their interests are, and what they're telling you is, here are all the things that are wrong with your idea, what they're telling you is, here are all the ways in which that fails to satisfy my interests, fine. Your purpose was to figure out what their interests were. And then if that doesn't work, hypothesize and test. And what that sounds like is saying, I can imagine that if I were in your position, I would care about the cash flow implications of an arrangement that we make, the precedent that it might set inside the organization, and the incentives that it would create for me. Is that right? Is that what you really care about? And then they say one of 2 things. They either say, yeah, in which case, okay, you know what the interests are on the other side. Or they say, no, that's not what I care about, and they tell you what it is. Fine. You don't have to be right. You're just trying to figure out what they care about. Right? Interests. So that's the first of the 4 elements that we're going to talk about tonight. The second is around options, and here's what I mean by options. I don't mean offers. Offers are how positional bargaining is structured, with offer, counteroffer, counter-counteroffer, rejection, counter-counter-counteroffer. That's not what I'm talking about. Options in the almost universally accepted language of negotiation as an academic discipline, options are possible component pieces of a deal that require the consent of both parties in order to take effect. They are ways of trying to satisfy one or more of the parties' interests in some way. So if you are doing a job negotiation in particular, an option might be an amount of salary, an option might be a job title, an option might be an office, an option might be the review cycle, it might be any number of different things. Those are all possible pieces of a deal that you and your future boss might come to. There are, broadly speaking, in the job context, 3 different kinds of options, which one negotiation scholar has categorized as asking, bending, and shaping. And by asking, what she means is things where you don't have to name that it's something you have to decide on. Everybody knows you have to decide on, for example, how many dollars will you get paid to do this job. You might ask for more, they might ask you to do it for less, but there's nothing sort of novel about the notion that you would be paid to do this job. It will have a title. Fine, there it is. You might ask for a title. They might give it to you or not. The second category of options are things that get called bending, and there the notion is, I know that normally July 1st is the usual start date. I got this thing with a thing, and could I start September 1st instead? Right, I'm not asking you to change the job fundamentally, I'm just trying to bend it a little bit. Then there are options that are shaping jobs. Those are where you and a prospective employer sit down to really think through, what could this job look like? What do you really need? Yeah, I got it that you advertised for that title, but what are you really trying to accomplish with that? And is there a way that we could structure something that looks really radically different? The answer might be no, but that would be something like, what if I did this other job that I know you don't have right now in the organization, but what you're saying is this is what you're really trying to solve, and here's what I would bring that. That would be a shaping sort of an option. Any 3 of these is possible in an employment context. Some are more prominent in some contexts than others. If you are going to go be an entry-level intern in an organization that is enormous and highly bureaucratic, it is unlikely that you will be doing a lot of shaping. You will be plugged in at the level that everyone gets plugged in at, and there will be a few places where you might be able to do some bending, but there won't be a lot of shaping. If you go work for some brand new Brown University spinoff, and you will be employee number 5, if you aren't having shaping negotiations, you're a goof. That's just a bad idea, right? Because they don't yet know what your skill sets are, what their needs are, and even if they have that figured out, a month from now, those needs are going to be different if it's a good organization, because they're going to be constantly figuring it out, and so you're going to want to. So the notion behind these options is that as you are going through these negotiations, you are coming up with the most elegant combination of options on all the different axes on which you would have to agree before you would say yes to a job and before they would agree to hire you on those terms. And I just want to be super explicit about one mistake that I have seen people make in good faith, very smart people who just don't do this particular thing well. In good faith, what they wind up saying is something like, well, look, there are really 4 things that we have to resolve. I don't really care what the 4 things are. Fill in whatever matters to you. Salary, benefits, title, location, whatever, right? There are at least 4 things that you and your future boss would have to agree on. Here's the mistake version of negotiating that. Okay, let's start with issue 1. How could we handle issue 1? And you brainstorm a bunch of different ways you could handle it, and you argue for A, and they argue for D, and you, I don't know, you decide on B, and you agree. Then you move on to issue 2, and you argue back and forth, and one side thinks they didn't get what they want on issue 1 so much, and so they get a little more than but they want on issue 2, and you agree. And you sort of continue, and you agree issue by issue. I get the logic behind doing it. It feels like you're making progress. Oftentimes what people will do is they'll start with something easy in quotation marks, and the notion is we'll build momentum. Or alternatively, we'll start with a hard thing and make sure we can get it resolved before we can. Those are both mistakes. Both of these approaches, whether you start with the easy or start with the hard, the notion of making sequential commitments through the various issues in play preclude the possibility of efficient trades, which is what you should be going for. After all, at the end of the day, what you are willing to do on any one of these issues depends on what the resolution will be on all of the other issues. What job title you are willing to accept depends on a lot of things. What salary you are willing to accept, how many vacation days you are willing to accept. All these will depend on how the rest of them get resolved. And so my suggestion is, maybe you'll care about one more than another. Don't agree to anything until you agree to everything. Right? So maybe you care most about issue, I don't know, 2 or 3, I don't know. Maybe what you should do is focus in on that thing you really, really, really super care about, and give them what they want on the rest. The headline is, don't agree on anything until you agree to everything. That requires you to look at packages, not issue by issue, as you go through these options, okay? All right. Third of the 4 elements that I want to talk about are under the label of criteria. Criteria are, some people think of them as standards of legitimacy, fairness. They are the ways in which an external party might measure what the right, in quotation marks, outcome would be that's outside of the volition of the parties. In a lot of negotiations, you resolve distributive questions based on who can yell and scream the loudest or hold her breath the longest or things like that. How would a judge decide? How would an outside arbitrator decide? They would look to some kind of measure of fairness. And I want to say a little bit more about why I'm talking about fairness, because I am sometimes misheard, and I want to try hard tonight not to misspeak about this. I am not saying the world would be a better place if we would all treat each other fairly. That may or may not be true. It's probably true, but that's not why I'm talking about this. I am saying if I am advising you, and our goal is to get you the best deal we can possibly get you, we still need to think about standards of fairness, not for the sort of kumbaya reason, but because we are trying to persuade another human being, and it turns out human beings care a lot about fairness in some ways that will help us to be persuasive to the other side. I'm going to show a video. It's like the one multimedia part of this presentation, so I'm going to invite you to be as impressed as you are capable of being, because it isn't going to get better than this. It's a video of a study done by a couple of professors, principally at Emory, and they study capuchin monkeys, and I have some. There are some limits to, I think, the applicability of primate studies on a lot of human interaction, but this one I think is illuminating, at least in the illustrative sense, if not beyond. You don't have to know much about capuchin monkeys other than they like cucumbers. All right, so just accept that. Trust me on this one, if nothing else. They like cucumbers. Like, they really like cucumbers. They love grapes. I invite you again to just trust me on this one. They love grapes. And so, as these research things go, they are trained to do a task in order to receive a benefit. And Professor DeWall will explain from here if I am doing this right.
We'll see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Again, we all know that. We've all been that. Like, there's something deep in that is not just about objective fairness, but about comparative fairness. There is something deep in us that wants badly not to be treated worse than someone else similarly situated. And so as a negotiation matter then, if that resonates at all, then what we should not want to do, if we're advising ourselves, is to find ourselves in the position of asking someone to treat us better than others who are similarly situated. Instead, as a strategic matter, we should want to invite the other person, let's say the boss, to think of us like other people being treated in a way that we would like to be treated. It triggers that fairness instinct in the boss. And these sorts of, the notion that fairness matters turns out not to be confined to the worlds of ethics and philosophy. This is not my sort of moral case to you. It is part of how most of us are built. We have the benefit now of being able to play games with people who find themselves in fMRI machines, voluntarily, to be clear. But there's a set of studies that are fascinating about what happens to our brains when we believe we are being treated fairly and not. Most of the studies have involved something called the ultimatum game. It's a game where one party is given a certain amount of resource and is told that they can offer some of that resource to a counterpart, who then has to accept or reject, and if they accept, then they both get that distribution, and if they reject, they don't. And the counterparts are the ones that get studied in the fMRI machine, where if they believe that the offer is fair, relatively speaking, something that is fair, the part of their brains that light up in the fMRI machine are the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's basically the part of our brain that is associated with higher rationality, creativity, and problem solving. And if the person in the fMRI machine playing this game is given an offer he or she perceives to be unfair, an entirely different part of the brain lights up. It is the bilateral anterior insula, the much more primitive part of the brain associated with anger and pain and distrust, and very interestingly, revenge. Our brains get triggered into places that are very different based on subjective assessments of the fairness with which we are being treated. And this has some implications for something like negotiation. I would invite you to join me just as a life principle in making the following assumption. Most people on this planet wake up in the morning imagining themselves to be the heroes of the relevant story. Most of us wake up in the morning not thinking of ourselves, today I shall play a bit part in someone else's life. Very few of us wake up in the morning and think, today I shall be deceiving, and if all goes super well, I will ruin a couple people's lives. Most of us imagine ourselves to be acting rationally and fairly, even with kindness. Most of us do. Odds are good the person with whom you are negotiating woke up this morning thinking of herself that way. Now, you might find disconfirming data in how she behaves, but if you're trying to persuade her, part of what you need to tap into is how on earth she thinks that she's being rational and kind and helpful and all those wonderful things. And one of the ways that you can do that is through exploring criteria. By criteria, and I'm going to suggest two things about criteria. Criteria are these external standards. So if all we cared about, and again, I've made my best possible case for you caring about more than just salary numbers, but if all we cared about was salary numbers, if you did a bunch of external benchmarking research, you could figure out what the range might look like of people in positions something like this. Those would be criteria. If you're going out to rent an apartment for next year, any number of websites will help you these days to know how grotesquely overpriced Providence real estate is, but we'll be able to put parameters around how grotesquely overpriced it is. Criteria can be used both as a shield and a sword. As a shield, the notion is that when the other side offers you something, you can say, that doesn't match perfectly with the research I've done about what is standard practice in this industry. Help me understand why. Notice that what I'm doing here with this sort of phrasing is I am inviting that person across the table from me to continue to be the hero, the rational, the kind. I'm just not understanding. Help me understand. I'm inviting them into the teacher posture with the notion that one of two things will happen. Either they will help me to understand something I didn't get when I did my initial research. Remember, they probably have info you don't, and so you have to be open to persuasion. Or they will change what they were offering because you are triggering in them, in their brains. You're taking advantage of the cognitive dissonance in their brains at that point, right? I know myself to be a rational, kind person. I know I'm a fair person. Those are the data. I guess the kind, fair thing to do would be this. And there it is. I had a friend in graduate school who was also studying negotiation alongside of me, and it was pretty much all we studied in graduate school. It was our reason for being there. And he was, at the time, trying very hard to pull the money together to buy his first car. And those of us studying negotiation along with him thought, this will be great. We'll give him lots of prep, we'll practice, we'll videotape it, we'll get him spreadsheets and the whole deal. And we did. We did simulations. We tried really hard to get this guy ready for his used car negotiation. And as he tells the story, he went to the used car lot, and he went and he stood next to the car that he sort of had his eye on, but he knew the other one that would be just right. We had this scripted. But we didn't go because we thought that would be a little weird. The 8 of us are here to buy a used car. That wasn't, we thought about it. We thought we could outnumber them, and then we realized that's just like the dumbest idea ever. So John went on his own, and he stood next to the car, and the salesman came up and said, I see you're looking at that one. And John said, yeah. And the salesman said, I can give that to you for $18,000. And John said, I mean, we had spent hours. And John said, my mind went blank. I had nothing. Like, I could not remember a single thing. And then out from somewhere deep, deep in, what came out of my mouth was, where'd that number come from? He said, I swear to God, the next thing the guy said was 15,000. And John thought, wait, it went from 18 to 15, and because all I did was ask where the number came from? He thought, this is great. And he said, where'd that number come from? And it turns out that if you've got in mind a positional haggle, what you're expecting the other side to say is some other number. By asking where a number comes from, by drawing the mind of the counterpart to criteria, what John was doing, wittingly or unwittingly, was to try to tie that figure to something other than what either was willing to do. Notice John didn't say no to 18 or to 15. He said, where'd the number come from? So you can use criteria as a shield. You can also use it as a sword, and I'll talk about that in a minute. First, just a word or two about one of the potential benefits of doing the research on criteria. There is a psychological phenomenon called anchoring that you may have run into in some of your classes. The notion behind anchoring is that although we would not coach ourselves for this to be true, it turns out it is true, that our brains latch irrationally on to the first numbers that we hear or see. And some of the studies around anchoring are amusing or disturbing, depending on where you see yourself in the study. One of the very early studies was one in which study participants were brought into a room where there was was sort of a Wheel of Fate video rolling in the background with a ball bouncing around. And in one condition of the study, the ball landed on the number 10. And in the other condition of the study, the ball landed on the number 65. They were otherwise identical. And the participants in each of those studies, this was done in 1973 or 74, the participants were asked a simple question, and that was, what percentage of African countries are currently members of the United Nations? It's the only question they were asked. And so they'd write in their guesses, and then the researchers tabulated their guesses. And it turns out that in the room where the ball landed on 10, the guesses averaged 25%. And in the room where the ball landed on 65, the guesses averaged somewhere just under 50. No rational person would think, I bet the percentage of African countries in the UN has something to do with that roulette wheel. Right? But there was something about their brains that got hooked and dragged toward one or the other of the anchors. There was another study done about a decade later where researchers went to a group of participants, went to people on the streets of San Francisco. I think it was San Francisco. And with one group of study targets, they just asked the question, what do you think the average temperature in San Francisco is in January? They recorded the guesses and moved on. In the second set of studies, they went and said, hi, I have two questions for you. First question, do you think the average temperature in San Francisco in January is above or below 558 degrees? And the people said, who are you? Right, and they said, just above or below, and like everybody would say below. And they'd say, oh, okay. What do you think the average temperature in San Francisco is in January? And they gave them their guess. The second group guessed an average temperature in San Francisco almost 20 degrees higher than the first group. There was something about the anchor that dragged their brains into an otherwise irrational place. Not that either of their guesses was irrational. What's irrational is that the anchor had an effect on it. So now out of this notion of anchoring comes some of the very terrible negotiation advice you are likely to hear. Well, I teach negotiation for a living, so I get negotiation advice from a lot of people, like all the time. And some terrible version of the advice goes like this: always make the first offer. That's terrible advice. But one thing it has going for it is the prospect that you will be able to take advantage of anchoring. Right? If you get to put the first number out, then maybe you'll suck their brains into crazy land. It goes to the logic. It's got a lot of flaws to it, this always make the first offer, right? Among others, the following. You go and you say, I won't work here for a penny less than 70,000. And they say, deal. You say, oh. Right? The winner's curse is a very real problem, especially in information asymmetries and whatnot. So we can talk more about that down the road. The other place that criteria can help you is as a sword. They advance a number that seems wrong to you, or they advance a term in your salary or job negotiations that seems off to you. The instinct may be to say no, and my suggestion instead is to say, that doesn't match what I've heard before. Why doesn't it match, right? That's the shield piece. The sword piece of this is for you to go in, rather than doing just the naked anchoring effort at first offer. If instead you lead with criteria, it's not an offer, it's you saying, I've looked and it appears to me that almost everyone in this job, in this industry, has a term like X. I can't think of a reason why your company would be different. Right? And then you invite them again into that fairness place in their brains. And it may help you to be persuasive. All right, last of the elements has to do with alternatives. What are you going to do if they say no? Turns out to be an unpleasant but super helpful thought exercise for many. There is something that you can do if they say no to you. Be as clear as you can about what that would be, and then, to the extent you are able in preparation, think hard about what they would do if you say no to them. And in the best possible world, what you would be doing is improving your alternative to a negotiated agreement. If you're looking at apartments, and there are three that are sort of, they look at least initially like they're probably, good enough, in range at least, don't go negotiate with the landlord of the one you like best first. Figure out what the world would look like in the others first. Make it as attractive as possible. Get the best possible terms you can so you can compare. And conversely, understand what their world looks like if you say no to them. Because if they are indifferent to you saying yes or no to them, they're not going to put much on the table. If they are over a barrel, if you say no to them, they are more likely to put something attractive on the table. Now, I'm not talking about doing anything illegal here, but if you have a sense of the other applicants for the job, and you know that one of your classmates was also going for this job, but she just took a different job, be helpful if she would let them know before you negotiate, right? So that their BATNA looks worse to them. All right, I'm going to pause there because I think we don't have a ton of minutes left, with the notion that interests and options and criteria and alternatives as a framework for preparing for these negotiations, and then to some extent conducting the negotiations, will help on balance for the job negotiations to go as well as possible. I'm going to pause. I will invite questions, and those of you who have to flee, you should flee, and there's no problem with that. What questions do you have? What can I answer about jobs? Yeah, please.
Any strategies for negotiations over the phone?
Oh, yeah. You mean other than don't? So a couple of things. When the communication is not face-to-face, it puts a premium on a couple of things. One would be, I would, to the extent you're able, try very hard to make sure that you have an understanding of the time frame that they have. It's easier in person to see visibly that someone's sort of packing up, like, oh, we're near the end of this conversation. It's much harder to hear on the phone, and so just as a concrete matter, at the beginning of the phone call, say, I just want to be super clear. I've cleared my calendar for this. How long do you have? Will help a lot, because sometimes there's an arc to these negotiations or these conversations. Second thing that I would do with telephone conversations is toward the end, I would say it's been very helpful. I'm going to send you a follow-up note capturing the things that I think we've talked about here, and I may also have some additional questions. Is that okay? Right. The more you can memorialize something that is a shared document, that's the kind of thing that often happens face-to-face, where you can both see you're writing out, and on the phone, that doesn't usually happen. Third thing, 40 bonus points for you for at least doing it over the phone and not over email, because, oh my gosh. And if you're even thinking, I was going to do this by text, just stop. Just stop it. There are lots of shenanigans that people engage in other sorts of ways. And so those are my first three thoughts around that. You might also, I guess four, you might also remember that most negotiations are iterated. And so this might be a conversation, but unless there's an exploding deadline, unless there's a reason why you have to get a deal by 5 o'clock or there's no deal, this could be one of several conversations which permit a multi-medium, multi-forum way of negotiating. Maybe they need to send you some documents for you to review. Maybe you want to think about it and get back to them in a day or two. Just keep that in mind. And that would be true even if it were face-to-face. It's just often harder for people to name that in a telephone negotiation, and so I think to name it to you here. Okay, good. What else?
Speaking of non-traditional forms, some applications online require you to place in an expected salary range. Is there any specific tactics to deal with that?
I once put in $1 billion just to see if it had any effect. It had no effect, as far as I could tell. I was thinking, anchoring, man, anchoring. It had no effect at all. If someone were to ask me that live, let me answer the easier question first. If I were to sit down with a boss who said, well, you know, what do you expect to make in this job? I would, in almost all circumstances, unless I have some just crazy lockdown solid criteria, I would avoid the question by saying something like, I expect to be compensated fairly for this, and I have a notion of what the appropriate market range looks like. Eager to talk with you about that. Again, if I have actual numbers, I might plug them in, but I try very hard to name the standard before I name the number. Because if the other side, if I guess incorrectly, I would much rather not trigger that part of their brain where they think I'm treating them unfairly. Right, remember the fMRI stuff? I want to negotiate with the person who is not angry and vengeful if I can avoid it, especially a future boss. Now, in an online form, there are two different kinds of online forms, not to get super granular, but I will here. Some freak out if you put anything other than a number in. Many of them are just text boxes, and you can put in something like, I expect to be treated fairly, and then press send and see if it accepts it, and if it does, great. And if it doesn't, sometimes they gag, and then you can try to put in a range, and sometimes they accept that, and sometimes it just wants a number and will not let you press submit if you don't have a number in there. And my suggestion is that's where you have to really, really do your homework. And I would say be aspirational with that number. Do not, it is super unlikely that they are going to look at that number and say, oh, we could actually do a little better than that. And so I would urge you to be aspirational, not crazy. And so the advice that I usually give to my students is this: do your homework, figure out what jobs like this, what kind of range usually exists, then become the best advocate for yourself you can be. If you had a friend, what would you tell your friend she should deserve for a job like this? Then add 10%. And I'm just making that up, but I mean, don't sell yourself short in naming an aspiration, but don't imagine that they'll go crazy, right? That they will mistake you for the CFO and add a digit to your, they're not going to, and they're going to think lowly of you. But I don't think badly of a prospective employee who thinks that she or he should be paid at the top end of the range of the thing I'm hiring for. I actually want to hire somebody who is at the top end of the range of skill. So why wouldn't you put the top end of the range? Homework is where he's going to help you with the range. Does that help? Okay. What else? Yeah.
Do you have any advice for negotiating for profit sharing or some sort of incentive?
Sure. So two quick things. One, as with anything, criteria will be your friend. If you're asking for profit sharing and no receptionist in the history of the company for which you've applied to be a receptionist has ever had in profit, that's going to be a hard call. So, look for standards in the industry. The other thing is profit sharing is a great place to take super advantage of the advice I gave around packages, not individual issues. Right? You should not need profit sharing. Profit sharing could be a great component of an overall compensation package. But if they pay you a guaranteed salary that's high enough, you are going to be happy to forego profit sharing. On the other hand, if they're having cash flow issues, et cetera, you might be able to come in and say, well, look, I might be able to do that on the base comp. If we could have a contingent comp with a bonus and a profit sharing around this sort of thing, right? Might we structure something like this? And they will either be open to thinking about it that way or not. What I would advise is bracketing the notion of what specific level or even what form the profit sharing takes. Because what you'd be willing to do and what incentives are created with something like stock options will depend a lot on the strike date, on the initial valuation, on the subsequent valuation, on how quickly they vest, on a bunch of different things. And so, great. Those are all things that you could put together with your prospective employer that might make sense. Depending on where the employer is and where they are in their financing rounds and things like that, they might think this is fantastic. It's unlikely that you're going to be the first one to suggest such a thing. They're going to have a notion of where the trade-offs are. If it's going to dilute their stock too far, of course they're not going to do it. But if it's a way of getting them a slightly lower burn rate as they're going for their next round, it could be a great thing to do. I would just say stay super flexible on it, because the reality is you have points of indifference between this form of compensation and that form of compensation and this form of compensation until you get a sense of how those intersect with your boss's incentives. You won't know which trade-offs to make, so keep them all open. Don't agree on anything until you agree on everything. I guess it's a short version of that. Got it. What else? Oh, we have.
Professor Moffitt after, we just do that to wrap it up, but.
We have to wrap it up. So let's wrap it up and then come on down. I'm happy to talk with you if you have more questions. So have a good night.